We all buy something at Best Buy for Christmas. You first need to go your direction about how to put it together, how to use and operate the piece of equipment you purchased. That's what the Constitution is for the United States. Then you have Article 1 that basically says, legislative branch, this is all your powers. This is everything you can and can't do. Article 2 in the manual is executive branch, these are all your powers. This is what you can and cannot do. And then Article 3 is saying with the judiciary. Then if you go to the very back of the Bill of Rights, you have the 10th Amendment, which is, oh, by the way, every power that's not in the handbook, in those articles for the three branches of the government, if it's not given to the federal government or prohibited, it is reserved to the states. That is as simple as I can make it for high school students. So, Governor, having talked about the 10th Amendment, how do your interpretations of the 10th Amendment shape your policy?
Explain it to me. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, look, my view is that we can talk about the Constitution, okay, on this, but we can also talk about practicality. I don't want to be, completely here off the deep end, but there's not a lot that seems to be working very well in Washington. And why? When a person tries to do everything, generally they don't do anything very well. And what we've seen is an accumulation of power in Washington, and it's just not working. So what we really need to do from a practical point of view, not just from a philosophical point of view, although I agree with the philosophy, which is if it's not something that the feds have to do, the state should be able to do it. But think about it this way. If I move education, K-12 education, from Washington into the states, then the states get to figure out what works for them. And then here's the beauty of it, is I look at what you're doing, you can look at what I'm doing as the governor of Ohio, or we can look at what's happening in Mississippi or Nevada, or wherever, and we can learn from one another. And then what it does is two things. One, it stops this one-size-fits-all mentality. Let me tell you, everybody in this room, whether everybody here I assume is a Republican, but if say you're not, doesn't matter. We know that the welfare system constantly needs to be reformed. But if you want to change the welfare system in fundamental ways, you have to go ask for permission for people in Washington. I don't like that idea. Let me run my program in my state the way I want to run it, based on our situation and our values. Not on the basis of somebody in Washington. They don't even know what time zone Ohio's in. If you call down there from Ohio, they'll say, no, what time is it there? We're at Eastern, by the way, in case you didn't know. So there's a couple things that get achieved. First of all, we get to end the one-size-fits-all mentality. Give you another one, job training. Basically, under the federal government's rules, including Republican Congress, you have to lose your job with the bulk of the money that goes to you before you can train somebody. Why wouldn't we train somebody while they're working so they don't lose their job? So why don't we just put job training right down here in the hands of the legislature? And so what we could do is we would be shifting power out of there, be shifting money out of there. We would begin to fashion solutions based on who we are, which all the states could then study. And then finally, we'd be centering the federal government on what it needs to do, not everything that it's doing now. And then that's consistent with what you have in the 10th Amendment. Now, we tried to do this, back when I was budget chairman, we did some changes. We did loosen some of the strings, but we had a Democrat president, and we couldn't get everything done we want. But I actually believe that welfare and Medicaid and education and job training and infrastructure, and probably more, need to be sent to the states. And then you go ahead and do it. Now, you got to spend the money on what it is you get the money to do. I mean, you can't take Medicaid money and pave highways, Senator. I'm not saying you would. I'm just saying to you, there has to be, some kind of guardrails. But frankly, you've got to do a better job of fixing these problems than they are from somewhere out. And that's what the 10th Amendment was all designed to say. But you got to have somebody that's going to do it. You got to just do it.
So, next I'm going to turn to the EPA. Some of you think that stands for the Environmental Protection Agency. I refer to it as the Eliminate Prosperity Agency because this avalanche of regulations coming down on businesses. One particular one that I'm working on right now, anyone heard of WOTUS, the WOTUS regulation, Waters of the U.S.? And basically what that says is they're redefining what is considered a water of the U.S., which is a navigable water that's interstate between the states in nature. Like the Mississippi River would be the most textbook definition. The way they've rewritten the rule, it could be a low-lying area in your backyard of your business or your home, a ditch that is filled with water that is ephemeral in nature and filled with water 2 or 3 months out of the year could now be a navigable water or a waters of the U.S. that you would have to go to the federal government, not state government, the federal government in order to build or use your land the way you want
See,
to.
that's where it goes back to what I talked about on regulations before. Number one, anything that is going to cost more than $100 million has to be voted on by the Congress. Number two, you have to have a cost-benefit analysis. In other words, the benefit from the regulation should be more than the cost. That's supposed to be applied, but it is not. Thirdly, I wanted to create in my budget, I wanted to create a people's court. They said that Judge, who's got a people? Judge Wapner has got a people's court. But here's what we're going to do. We do this in Ohio, even with our EPA. I would appoint a bunch of people who are independent to be a place for us to go when bureaucracies are coming up with really bad rules. And you would have a place to go that could join you in your effort to reverse a decision that we would patently know is absurd. First of all, of course, you've got to have people that run these things who are not out there to make these decisions that are extreme. And by the way, in my state, my EPA director is loved by small business. Because, we want to make sure we have a good environment. You just don't want to be crazy about this. So I'll give you an example. We have a fracking industry in Ohio. We have very, very tough rules on fracking. We want to know what you're putting in the ground. We want to know if there's a fire on the wellhead, you've got to report it. We do a lot of things like that. But you know what? The companies, they're fine with it. You know why? Because it's simple, it's clear, and if you make a mistake, we're not there to pound you into the ground. I mean, if you have an evil intent, that's one thing. But if you make a mistake, we'll help you. So, I mean, can you imagine that my EPA director is so appreciated by small business? And you can do this, but then the key is, and look, I mean, I've got the whole issue with bureaucracy as well. You solve people throughout your bureaucracies to carry out your purpose. And the purpose is common sense. Don't be saying because you got water in your backyard, somehow, you can't walk into your backyard. I mean, that's so ridiculous, right? So we got to get a little common sense, and the common sense is the kind of people you put in, and then you have other opportunities to make sure you get it done. See, frankly, all these federal rules need to be reviewed, and the ones that don't make any sense ought to be gathered up in a bundle, and they ought to be repealed. And secondly, you've got to have people inside those bureaucracies who understand what it's all about, and they got to understand that the most important thing for a person to do is to create a job for somebody. And if they're killing jobs, then they're hurting families, communities, states, and the country. So actually, folks, it's a hard thing, but if you can get the right management, if you've got the right leadership from the top, and at the same time, you encourage people who work in these agencies to use common sense and for them to realize that what they do in their job matters. You can do that. You can get people's morale up and you do a better job. So this is a real big issue in this country because the regulatory side, whether it's Dodd-Frank on banks or whether it's EPA and excessive regulations, I mean, you're suing the EPA right now. I'm suing it because it's going to shut down a chunk of my economy. Based on some rule that, I don't even think they have the authority. This is going to end up, I hope, in the Supreme Court where they're going to be able to rule on excessive regulatory decision-making. I guess I've had that on my chest for a while.
The bottom line is the need to balance a livable environment with the cost of regulations, and not mutually exclusive. We can do both.
Yeah, you can do both. You don't need to say we have to have it, on fracking, for example. It's controversial, right? I mean, people read about it, and it's controversial. It's not controversial for me. It's just that you don't come in and you don't do dumb things, and we'll have some guidelines and you follow them. And that's the end of it. And what companies don't want is uncertainty and things that are just excessive, that don't add anything and just are punitive. So in the beginning, I had people that were protesting, we're going to have fracking, right? People were like, oh no, we have these protesters out here. I said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to take these moms who have kids who graduated from college who are living in their attic, who could get a job in the energy industry, and I'm going to have the moms have a talking to the protesters. That'll be the end of that. And the fact of the matter is we've got an industry that is growing. It's not the end of everything here, but it's fine, and if we keep managing it the right way, we'll have great success on this.
Okay, I'm going to move quickly now because I want to try to give a few minutes to the folks out here who came to see you of Obamacare. Been challenged twice by the states. I was in both of those lawsuits, 5-4 votes. We're not going to litigate why the Supreme Court was wrong. But what would you do to work? What would you do? Would you work to repeal Obamacare? And so what would you replace it with?
Well, first of all, of course, we would get rid of it because it's imposed higher costs, first of all, on insurance because of all the mandates. So the mandates are everybody's for that. The Republican Party cannot, you know why we have Obamacare? Because Republicans had the majority for a long time and they didn't do anything about people who had pre-existing conditions and people who couldn't get health insurance. I mean, that's not it. I mean, what are you going to have somebody go bankrupt because they got a condition that they can't get insured for? I mean, that's just wrong. So we should have been working aggressively to have a program in place that was market-driven. So the first thing I would do is to get rid of a lot of those mandates. That would drive the cost of insurance down. We need to make it affordable. Secondly, I would take some of the federal resources and block grant them down here in South Carolina, and I would combine it with Medicaid so that the working poor would be able to have some form of health insurance. And so that's what I would do initially. But longer term, we have a bigger issue. The issue is we practice medicine that rewards quantity. If the general, God forbid, had to go to the hospital tonight and he needed 2 tests, Senator, how many do you think he'd be given?
12.
12 somebody. If you go to the hospital and you need a CAT scan to give you an MRI. You know why? Because no one cares. No one's connected to this. So the costs keep going up. And I believe there's a better way to do this. I believe that we could use a market system to reward people for keeping us healthy or getting us healthy once we're sick. And that is a whole change in the way we think of healthcare. Our primary care physician ought to get money in his or her pocket for keeping us healthy. And there are ways to get this done. We are driving this nationally out of Ohio. And let me just give you an example. There is an agreement between the Children's Hospital in Columbus and the insurance company. One of the biggest reasons why, probably the biggest reasons why children end up in the hospital is for asthma. So it used to be if you had asthma, they stick you in the hospital. Now I had a daughter that had RSV as a baby. She needed to be in the hospital. But what they found is a big chunk of people who were being put in the hospital don't have to go into the hospital. They can be treated on an outpatient basis. So if they're treated that way, that means the hospital loses money, right? They don't have as many visits. The insurance company, they got more profits because they're not paying claims. So guess what happened? The hospital and the insurance company is sharing the fact that the kid was not put in the hospital. Sharing. So we need to know how our hospitals do. We need to know how our physicians do. We need to make sure that the patient is in the middle of all this, and we need to use a market-driven system to change the whole way in which we think about medicine. You don't know what your doctor makes. You don't know if your doctor's any good, do you? I mean, if I were to ask, how many in here have a great doctor, you'd all raise your hand. If I were to say, how many of you in here have a great hospital? How's your hospital doing? You wouldn't know. Because transparency doesn't exist. And the ability to shop as a consumer is really critical. And the ability of the health plans to drive more efficient but yet high quality health care doesn't exist right now. It's starting to, but it doesn't really exist. Here's what the problem is, folks. My dad carried mail on his back. His father was a coal miner, and my mother's mother couldn't speak English. You know what happens when people start rationing health care? Who do you think gets rationed? You think the guy who's the CEO gets the ration? Or is it the mailman who gets the rationing? So we have to confront this issue. We have to slow down the cost of health care while keeping the quality high so we all can benefit. Now, you know, I have to go in debate stages where I get to talk for 6 minutes about how to fix the healthcare system, okay? I mean, total that and how we can secure world peace. But that's why these forums are important, because then you get to hear extensively how people are going to deal with these things. Finally, as a governor, I can't blame somebody else. Oh, you know, I didn't get this done because Obama was president. I have to lead. I have to have a result, just like Nikki Haley. You got to show what you did. You get a report card. And then when you're an executive, you got to face reality. And that's why we have to think very seriously about whether we want somebody who has not been an executive, who we can judge based on what they've done, because that's the best way to figure out what they might do to lead our country.
Thank you.
That's it.
Dodd-Frank is where I want to go next. So, like Obamacare, Dodd-Frank is a bill that's over 2,000 pages long. Like Obamacare, Dodd-Frank is a law that has tens of thousands of pages of regulations to implement it. Like Obamacare, Dodd-Frank centralizes control of an entire industry in Washington, D.C. by unelected bureaucrats who rule through administrative fiat. So Dodd-Frank is enshrined too big to fail on Wall Street while making capital harder to get on Main Street. That is one of the issues with Dodd-Frank. What would you propose we do with Dodd-Frank, and what would you recommend in the free market in regulating the financial industry, if at all?
Well, I think that the financial industry does have regulations. I mean, we don't want to have no regulations in the financial industry. But the problem with Dodd-Frank is it's gone so strong that your community banks and your regional banks are getting crushed. And what we're going to end up with is them selling. You know that. Maybe you don't know that. I'm sure you don't. If you're a small business person, you kind of know it, because there's so many rules and restrictions on you. First of all, you're having a hard time dealing with the burden of reporting. But secondly, it's so difficult to make loans today. And if you're a small business, if you can't get a loan from your local bank, who do you think you're going to get it from? I mean, not that there wouldn't be big banks that would loan, but that's not what works really efficiently. In terms of the big banks, if they're going to take risks, they got to reserve their own money to take those risks. That's what I think they should do, so that we don't have to bail them out. So based on the risk, they ought to be the ones to have to set aside their own assets in order to cover that risk. So we don't want to have no regulations, but we don't want to have regulations that are going to wipe out the small banks, and this whole thing either needs to, when you say repeal, that sounds good, everybody. I don't know the practicality of that, but the practicality is there to skinny all this down and make sure that our small banks are not going to be crushed. Because when they can't deal with it, they sell to a big bank. I mean, that's what happens. And then you don't have your little bank. I got the Delaware County Bank. I called them yesterday. I said, you need to stop payment on a check because somebody, the check is lost. They don't make me come in. I said, okay, Laura's there. Laura knows me. How's it going, John? We read about you in the paper. Why don't you come into the bank once in a while? I mean, we have a relationship, and that's what you want with your local community, right? I mean, I have this pharmacy. It's called the Uptown. I call it the Uptight Pharmacy, and I go there and I pay a little bit more, but I want the community. I want them to deliver something to my house if I'm not there. So we don't want to be stomping out these little folks because Congress got carried away and did something too extreme.
And I've spoken to bankers who told me that they used to give, these are community bankers who used to give character loans to a guy they grew up playing basketball with, who's a farmer, and now they're terrified of giving a character loan, and that farmer can't go to the big bank and get the loan anymore. So it's made it very difficult for small town businesses and bankers to lend money to.
Small business is it. I mean, in our state now, no small business will pay income tax. Small businesses are the ones that create jobs.
Yeah.
Pretty good, isn't that, Senator? Yeah. No payment of income tax for small business, because they pay on the individual level, and we just don't do that. We also killed the death tax, by the way, so a small business can turn their business over to their kids without having to visit the undertaker and the tax guy on the same day. And now that we've killed the death tax. We're working on killing death. We haven't made a lot of progress.
Well, that's really good. And one banker, I'll close with this.
We know we're killing death. That's a good thing if we can get there.
Well, a banker once told me, he says, for every dollar I have to spend on regulatory compliance, meaning hiring another lawyer or a regulation compliance officer, that's 10 less dollars I can give to a home as a home loan, or 10 less dollars to a small business loan, or 10 less dollars to a student loan. And he says there's a lot of dollars we're having to spend on regulatory compliance. We obviously want to be regulated, but we don't want to be strangulated. So, moving on. So I'm not going to qualify the question. I'm just going to say the topic in order to try to get to you guys. Second Amendment. This is a Second Amendment state. I think we have a lot of gun owners. Our brothers. Okay, good. Anybody want to ask anything on the Second Amendment? We'll move forward. National Labor Relations Board. This is a very pro-right to work state. Very first month I was in office, I heard of the NLRB. They try to prevent a small startup airplane company from moving to North Charleston. You might have heard of them, Boeing. What kind of people would you like to see the National Labor Relations Board? What role do you think?
You can't have bias, people that are, tilting everything one way. You gotta have balance. That's the way you gotta do it. You can't have a politicized board like that. That's just not, it's completely inappropriate. And I've read about some of the fights that you've had down here, and it's none of their business. I don't think, not the NLRB. I mean, it shouldn't be a partisan, left-leaning, or it should be something that's balanced. I don't know, really, I'm not an expert in the NLRB, but I get the sense it's become very, very political, and I don't like that.
The next area I'd like to touch on is religious liberty. I've talked to people around South Carolina, around the country, and everyone recognizes the Supreme Court's ruling on Obergefell, the same-sex marriage case, and people obviously don't want to discriminate or treat their fellow citizens any differently, but people are also concerned that religious liberty, the right to practice your convictions, could be infringed upon by the government. Do you believe that there's a balance to protecting the new right of same-sex marriage with the rights of people to run their businesses, whether it's a cake baker or a wedding planner, the way that they want? Is there a balance?
Look, the only thing I can tell you is if you're in the commerce business and you're making cupcakes, just make cupcakes. Okay, that's kind of my feeling. I'm for the traditional definition of marriage that the court has ruled, and in my opinion, we move on from that. Now, I will tell you that nobody has the right to impose these kinds of things on our religious institutions. I belong to a church, and our minister's not going to perform gay weddings. We're just not going to do it, and we shouldn't have to. But I've been to a gay wedding, by the way. A friend of mine got married in a secular ceremony, and I asked my wife if she was going to go. She said yes, and so I went with her. It was fine. And so I think these are really tough issues. But my sense is you've got to be very careful not to impose this on our religious institutions. That's where you absolutely draw the line.
Would you defend the tax-exempt status of churches who want to practice their faith a certain way?
No.
Okay.
No. Why would we do that? We have to protect their ability to perform what they perform, like my church. I belong to an Anglican church. We're not going to be performing gay weddings, which is not. If they try to take away our tax-exempt state, that's not going to happen. If I'm president, there's no way that's going to happen. So don't worry about it.
Well, I'm asking these questions because these are hot button topics, and I feel like they deserve to be asked. Last question, then we'll go to, I know we're getting to the end, but I just recently sent a letter to the President of the United States on the closing of GIFO and the transferring of
We're not
the
detainees.
detainees.
Forget that.
Okay.
That's ridiculous. Are they going to move that
South Carolina is one of the 3 states that have been mentioned in Charleston.
here? No, I'm not doing that.
That's good to know because I agree with you. All right, I'm going to go ahead, and right now it is 1:30, okay? I know lunch is important to people, and getting back to work is also important. We started about 5 to 10 minutes late, so do y'all want to take 5 to 10 minutes and take some questions from the audience? And if you feel like we need to get back to work.
Yeah, go ahead, shout it, ma'am.
Go. So we have a traveling mic.
Oh, we do, okay.
We do? If not, I will lend you mine.
General, can I take your one?
You may take my mic, Leo.
Here, I'll tell you what, let me just come down.
Or the governor, he wants to walk, so.
I was late pressing, and I'm a little sore. You know what late pressing is? We should all do it, it's good weight training.
Hi, John. I met you in about 20 years when I was visiting Washington, D.C. I met you in an elevator and thought you were a great guy.
You know, meetings like that, that happens real ups and downs.